All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Taylor Post, Swiftland's office manager, and I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar, What Library School Didn't Teach You, Dealing with Difficult Behaviors, and today's presenter, Linda Bruno. Linda Bruno has been developing and conducting training workshops for libraries and other organizations for more than 15 years. She offers workshops on topics ranging from leadership skills to returning balance and lots of areas in between. Linda received her MBA from the University of Florida and has years of experience in hands-on management positions. She develops her workshops based on solid research and, more importantly, real-life application. Linda is also certified with DDI and Achieve Global. Please welcome Linda and enjoy her webinar. Linda?
Thanks so much, Taylor, and welcome from my little corner of the world as well. I want you to notice first off on the very first slide that it says dealing with difficult behaviors. Did you notice it doesn't say fix the people who exhibit difficult behaviors? It doesn't say change the people who exhibit difficult behaviors. It says dealing with them. That puts the responsibility on us, doesn't it? Because if there was a way to change those people and make them not exhibit those difficult behaviors, that person would be a billionaire, whoever invented that way. But instead, almost every week I get something in my email about how to handle this kind of a difficult behavior, how to handle that kind of behavior, and so forth. So we know there is no magic bullet, but in a sense there is, because we can be that magic bullet. So I want you to kind of open your mind to that perspective as we walk through today's session. And I've done a lot of research and a lot of pondering and reflection on this particular topic because people crave it. But what I found is there are dozens of difficult behaviors out there. And in a 60-minute webinar, I wanted to kind of funnel that down to four basically that I hear the most about as I travel around to different libraries in the state of Florida. I do travel some out of state as well, but my focus is on Florida. And these are the behaviors that I hear a lot about. So those are the ones we're going to focus on today. And then also some tips for us on how we can handle ourselves in those situations. So with that being said, we know that we need to look at ourselves as we're going through today. And I love this quote, not because of the single footstep and all of that, but the very last statement that says to make a deep mental path, we must think over and over the kind of thoughts we wish to dominate our lives. And the reason I started with that quote is because I think we can get into a habit of looking at a particular person and thinking, oh boy, here we go again, before the person ever even opens their mouth. If we've had a difficult experience with them in the past, we tend to cast that net on them for future experiences, don't we? So I want you to think about that too. What is going through your mind as you're dealing with others who exhibit difficult behaviors? One of the things that used to go through my mind, not so much anymore because I've studied this so much, is that I just didn't know what to do with that behavior. I didn't know how to respond. I always felt intimidated by that person. And we need to fix that for ourselves, don't we? So let's take a look at it. Number one says, have you ever whined, complained? You see the list there. Pick out one word that you or phrase that you have been guilty of and type that into the chat box. Complained. Yes, Janet, I bet there's nobody in the room that has not, right? That has never complained. Now, there are chronic complainers, and that's one of my pet peeves, if you will. That's a difficult behavior along with whining, those kind of cross over. But to me, that's one of the ones that I'm challenged to deal with because I try to be an optimist and I don't tolerate that complaining very well, and yet I've done it myself. Michelle said, lost your temper. Check, check. Withdrawn completely. Eva, that used to be my mode of dealing with every difficult behavior. I was just interacting with a friend of mine this morning, and he was saying something about my husband's family and so forth. And I just said to him that I used to withdraw from angst or anything like that until I learned how to deal with that myself, withholding true feelings. And how do we expect people to really know how to respond to us if we withhold our true feelings, right? Several of you mentioned that. Eva said guilty, yes. Lost temper, yes. To avoid conflict, and sometimes that's okay. I don't want to ever I don't want you to think that you're supposed to be perfect, that you would never exhibit certain behaviors, because some of these behaviors are acceptable in certain circumstances. And I'm not going to voice my feelings to every single person I come in contact with because I won't have any friends. Some of those days where I'm a little bit of a grumpy cat and I come into the world and everybody gets on my nerves that day. I don't need to express those true feelings, do I? So sometimes it's okay. We just need to know when it's creating more of an issue with somebody else's difficult behavior. And Ernestine said delayed making a decision. And that can be frustrating for other people, can't it? It can be a difficult behavior for other people we're supposed to be interacting with. So I just wanted you to kind of get a snapshot for where you are in the world and the fact that you might actually be somebody else's difficult behavior. So think of that. When you think of somebody really close to you, what's one of your behaviors? It doesn't even have to be on that list, but what's one of those behaviors that drives them crazy? It might be the same one you already typed, but it might be something totally different. Ah, yelling. That's funny. And I don't know if it's pronounced LGS, so I'm going to pronounce it that way. And I apologize if I get it wrong. But that's one of the things that I mentioned in this email to my friend was that was my husband's go-to response because of his background. And I put in my email this morning until he figured out that I wouldn't participate. So I totally get that. Eva said probably impatient. Deborah said, ignore them. And that doesn't really solve anything most of the time, does it? And Deborah, in all honesty and in all fairness to us, sometimes that is the only way we should deal with it. So none of this is set in stone. We have to be discerning about how we're going to deal with these things, don't we? And Wendy said, tune them out. And again, sometimes that's the most appropriate thing so that we don't express our own difficult behaviors when something's going on. So there's that fine line between when is it appropriate for me to respond and try to deal with that difficult behavior, and when is it appropriate for me to either tune them out, withdraw, do whatever I need to do. So keep that in mind, and only you know the answer to that. What I want to encourage you to think about is don't always go to being in their face, trying to deal with them, and don't always go the other way either, that you always withdraw or that you're always impatient with them or ignore them or tune them out. So we just need to be aware of our own behaviors. So now I want to ask you a little bit of a flip side. I've already shared with you one of the difficult behaviors that I find hard to deal with, and that is the whiner, the complainer. Nothing's ever right. If you say, isn't the sun pretty? They say, yeah, but I wish it would rain. Those kinds of things. What's the difficult behavior you find? Passive aggressive. Yes, yes, yes. My sister, bless her heart, she passed away Easter Sunday of this year, actually. But she struggled with this all of her life. She had very low self-esteem. And I talked to her between an hour and 90 minutes every week. And there were weeks where I felt like the entire hour or 90 minutes was spent trying to get her to express her true feelings. Wendy said procrastinate and talk too much. Both of those can be frustrating for people, can't they? Either way. So understanding which ones frustrate you will help you today. We won't be able to touch on all of them because, as I said, we're going to cover 4 main ones, but we will be able to give you tips that will help you deal with your own emotions as you're dealing with people. And Ernestine said she too gets tired of the complaining. Janet said worrying about what others are doing instead of doing your own work. Exactly, Janet, because I put that down actually in a journal that I keep the other day. And I said, um, I heard this many years ago. Comparison causes discontent, doesn't it, Janet? Now, whose responsibility is that? I don't care if somebody else is getting paid more, if they do a better job, if they're getting more attention. It's my responsibility not to get discontented about that. And as you just said, gossiping is also another frustrating thing. Something else to remember as we talk about these four today, and as I mentioned, there are dozens. The book that I'm going to refer you to in a few minutes mentions 16, which would take us a lot longer than 60 minutes to cover. But we also need to realize that people's difficult behaviors can actually morph within the same conversation, can't they? They can change into something else because if they're not getting their way and they're not intimidating you like they're trying to, or they're not trying to win the argument, then they'll find some other way to do it. And so sometimes right within the same conversation, they can change from one difficult behavior to another. So that's why articles are still being written and books are still being written and webinars are still being held because we never know what kind of a landmine we're getting into. And Eva said the argumentative person, which kind of can cross over right in with the complaining, can it? Because it's that person where you're trying to put a positive spin on something, they're going to argue with you about how terrible it is, and sometimes we just need to refrain from engaging in that. When I was thinking about this particular topic, I thought, we deal with difficult people every day, most of us. And if we're not dealing with them in person, they're on social media or they're in the news or we're hearing about them somehow. So why would it be important to try to even deal with those behaviors? The first thing I came up with is less frustration. If I can control my own emotions responding to them, then I'm going to have less frustration. I guarantee that because I've practiced this for so long. I don't always accomplish it, but I am much, much better than I was even 10 years ago. So it's less frustration for me. The other day, something happened with a difficult person, and it was by email. And I actually let the email sit overnight because my frustration kicked in within, I'm going to say 60 seconds of reading the email. So I knew that that frustration would come across in my response. And if I responded that way, I would escalate the difficult behavior on their part and probably join right in with them. So I waited until the next day. And by that time, I had talked to myself. And yes, I do talk to myself. And I even answer myself sometimes because I said, you know what? That person has their own opinion, their own perspective, and they are absolutely entitled to that, whether or not I agree with it. And after I had about a 5-minute conversation with myself that same day I got the email, the next day I woke up feeling very peaceful about it. Even though I still disagree, I feel very peaceful about it because I didn't respond in a manner that would make them feel as if I was exhibiting a difficult behavior. So less frustration then equals less stress. I don't know anybody in this room that wouldn't like to put a little check mark beside less stress if we were saying, what will this accomplish? Most of us have enough stress in our everyday lives without heaping on our responses to difficult behaviors and making it even worse. Because when we have less frustration and less stress, we have better health. And guess what? When we have better health, we have less frustration and less stress. So it's one of those cyclical things. We go around in a little cycle, only this is a good cycle to have, having less frustration, less stress, which leads to better health because it enables us to control our emotions better. When we aren't feeling well because of frustration or stress, and we maybe have a headache or our stomach is churning, then we are going to engage in difficult behaviors a lot quicker than we do when we have better health because we've watched that frustration and stress. Another thing is less conflict in our workplace. Again, it happens so easily now that if we can even lessen it by 15 or 20% just because of our own awareness and our own participation in trying to make sure we're not adding to it, then we'll have a better workplace. That's better morale, isn't it? And when we have better morale, we have better productivity, we have less absenteeism, we have better retention of people staying in our library environment because it feels good to them. They feel comfortable, they don't feel attacked, et cetera, et cetera. So we have lots of reasons to really take hold of this today. And for those of you who are familiar with the way I do programs, the reason I give you handouts, many times it's to keep you engaged, it's to help you remember, which is all important and all proven statistically by science that it's helpful. But another reason I do it is because maybe you won't come across a difficult person for a month, I hope. Wouldn't that be wonderful? And you think, oh, I wish I had that webinar right in front of me right now to think about how I'm supposed to handle this. If you have your handouts, and you fill them in, then you have a little mini manual when we're done. And so I would encourage you to do that. The C answer was health, better health, Ernestine, because if we have less frustration and less stress, we will have better health. So if you think about it, really the answer to dealing with behaviors or people, if you want to say it that way, is communication, isn't it? You're welcome, Ernestine. We want to make sure that we're communicating in a way that we are not fanning those flames. We want to make sure that however we're responding, it's actually minimizing the angst and the anxiety and the anger and frustration. So communication is going to be key to that, whether it's verbal or whether we just don't communicate, because if we do, we're going to make it worse or whatever it might be. But we need to make sure we're aware of our own communication. Keep in mind you need to talk to the person, not at them or about them. I had somebody upset. It's been months ago now, and I always offer, email me afterwards if you want to flesh something out. And this person emailed me and gave me a scenario that was happening in their workplace, but that person was going to somebody else to talk about it. And I always am at the risk of stepping on people's toes when I give an honest, objective answer, but I did that anyway. And I said, okay, what I'm hearing is you're not going to that person. You're talking about them to someone else, and that someone else is trying to help you solve it. But because you're going behind their back, so to speak, it's escalating. That person got upset with Linda Bruno, but that's okay because I told it like I saw it. And I really believe that you need to talk to that person, unless it's a situation where it's physically dangerous or something like that. That's beyond my pay grade. That's not what we're talking about here today. We are not talking about mental health issues here today. We're just talking about those in general difficult behaviors that people exhibit. So, how do you deal with them? The very most effective strategy is to manage how you interact with them. If you recall nothing else from today, and the next time you are with somebody who exhibits a difficult behavior and you think to yourself, I need to manage how I interact with them, that will put you on the plus side of this equation. You will be doing better maybe than you've done in the past. At least that's what happens with me. When I think to myself, uh-oh, I'm getting upset, I'm getting angry, I'm getting resentful, I'm getting frustrated, whatever it is, if I think inside my head before I let my mouth open, a lot of times I can de-escalate that situation. So please remember, the most effective strategy is to manage how you're interacting with them, not manage them, but how you interact with them. So the book I mentioned a little bit earlier, and we're on page 2 now. The book I mentioned earlier is called Dealing with People You Can't Stand. And that's actually the reason I bought the book many years ago, was because I love the title. And I did read it, and I was reading another book on difficult behaviors at the same time, and a lot of it was very similar. So there's a lot of study that has gone into this and a lot of forethought that has gone into how we need to deal with people. But what this book was talking about, by a couple of doctors who have studied it, is that people are motivated by certain things, and that's why they behave the way they do. And in this book, it talks about people are motivated by either wanting to get something done, get something right, get along with people, or they call it get appreciated. But in my mind, I think of it as getting attention, because a lot of the get appreciated behaviors aren't really positive. So from my perspective, it's more about getting attention. So if you think about that when you're dealing with people, it helps you understand where they're coming from and how you can interact with them differently so that they do not achieve what they're trying to achieve if it's negative. So the first behavior, and some of you mentioned the behaviors of arguing and things like that. One of the first behaviors that came up in the book, and one of the primary ones that people struggle with, is that the person tries to run over you. And we call those the tanks or the bulldozers or whatever or not acronym, but whatever little tag you want to give them, whatever little nickname you want to give them. You know them because they seem to be on a mission. They seem to be out to get you. They're going to bulldoze right over you and get their way. So that would be the behavior of getting something done, wouldn't it? That's what their motivator is. They tend to push you around, and if you let them, they'll do more of it. Sometimes people think, well, if I just let them go, everything will calm down. No, you just rewarded that behavior. And so what gets rewarded gets repeated, and they'll do it again. This is also the person that rips you apart personally sometimes, but they don't really, usually, almost always, they don't mean it. They're just doing it to accomplish what they need to accomplish. I used to work in a corporate job, and this was one of the tactics that was used by a couple of the people that I worked with. And I'm going to be honest with you, when I worked there and I wasn't studying this kind of thing, I let them do this to me, which happens to be one of the reasons I left that job. I didn't recognize any of that at the time, but I knew why I was leaving, and I felt like I was always being abused, if you will, emotionally abused by the tanks that I worked with. So they rip you apart personally. I don't think they had anything personal against me, but they would make snarky little remarks that made me feel bad in front of other people. And then they would ask me to do big projects because they trusted me. And so there was that mixed message that went on. They seemed to be rude and insulting, but if you call them on it, on the rude and insulting part, most of the time they'll deny it anyway. So it comes down to, what should I not do with a tank? I don't want to counterattack because they will just get bigger. Think of a small tank that's coming at you. You counterattack, they get bigger, don't they? And that can be very frustrating as well. Don't try to defend or explain, because they're just going to pretty much ignore you, and you need to make sure that you don't give them more ammunition in their tank. Don't become that passive person, because they'll keep running over you, won't they? And don't close the door on the fact that you can work through this, whatever it is. You don't have to just walk away or ignore them or whatever. You can work through this most of the time. So, okay, Linda, you just gave us a whole big long list of what not to do, but what should we do? Well, first of all, keep in mind that you're trying to get respect from these people, because the tank has this attitude that their way is the only way. Remember, get it done. And so you want to get respect for them for your own opinion. Well, how do you do that? Karen, what's your really question about? I tend to get really wrapped up in what I'm saying, so I never know for sure what somebody's responding to. So I'm going to wait for Karen for just a second. She's typing, and we'll see what her question was. Says she's still typing. Because all the things you said before are the ones that just frustrate me. Exactly. Okay. The things that we're not supposed to do, right? Those frustrate you. Yes, absolutely. Somebody else's behavior like that frustrates you, but you're trying to get respect from people. So here's what I want you to think of: when you are dealing with somebody else's difficult behavior that's a tank, you want to hold your ground, don't you? You don't have to get argumentative to hold your ground. There's a continuum between passive and aggressive, and if you can just be assertive, holding your ground, knowing your stuff, making sure they understand they're not going to bulldoze you, you will get farther than you will if you get into a shouting match, if you get into an argument, if you go hide from them, if you withdraw. Hold your ground. This is not always easy. Your stomach can be churning. But I will tell you that every time you accomplish this and you notice that this person isn't behaving as much like that with you anymore, it doesn't mean they're not behaving that way. They might be doing it with somebody else, but maybe not with you, because it doesn't work anymore. Then the next time you're with them, you feel even stronger with them. So you want to hold your ground. You might need to interrupt the attack if they're just being loud and obnoxious and almost physically running over you. You might want to say something like, whoa, whoa, hang on just a second. I heard you say blah, 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 and you backtrack into something that they said that you can latch onto as being something you need to discuss. You could say, Deb, I just heard you say that you think the program we're doing is stupid. Help me understand why that's stupid. So you've stopped the attack, and you've also backtracked into something that maybe they have a good point about, but they're addressing it all wrong. And it's offensive. And your response is to get defensive, right? Because they've offended you. So we just need to be careful with that. And remember, I mentioned earlier, you always have the option of emailing me after this program or any program I do and touching base with me and saying, okay, here's a behavior that I deal with all the time. What are some tips and techniques that I might be able to use to stop that behavior or to lessen it with me? I'm always happy to respond to those. Now, sometimes when the tank is saying something about you, it might be true. Maybe you tried a program, you didn't check with people to see if they thought it would work, or you didn't take this person's advice, and now you've wasted some time or some money or whatever. And what they're saying is true. So how do you deal with that? You admit the mistake, you say what you learned, and you say what you're going to change in the future. You don't spend a lot of time on this. You don't have to grovel. You just need to be willing to admit that maybe they are right. I could say, Deb, you mentioned that the program was stupid, and I don't think it was stupid, but I think maybe I didn't take enough time to investigate whether that's the program our patrons would have liked. I've learned now that I need to start earlier so that I can talk to patrons and coworkers, and in the future, that's what I'm going to do to make sure a program is successful. Now, that's not easy, folks. We have been taught, especially in more recent memory, to never take the blame. It's always somebody else's fault. So for us to admit the mistake and say what we learned and say what we're going to change, it isn't easy. Exactly, Karen. I totally get that. I'm learning. I happen to have done a lot of training with a lady that has become a dear friend of mine, and she was so good at this. And she would just look at you and say, you know what? You're right. I never thought of it that way. Next time we do this, let's do XYZ. And the first couple of times I thought, okay, who are you and what do you want? Because I was so suspicious of that behavior. We just don't do that very often. So if we're willing to do that, I've done it a couple times and I did it as recently as this week with somebody who sort of attacked me. It was that attack that I needed to interrupt. And I kind of gave them permission to think negative thoughts about what we were doing. And I said, I can understand why you feel that way. And here's XYZ. And let's take a look at this. And all of a sudden I deflated them. It is sarcastic, Karen, if you mean it that way. But I really didn't mean it that way. I thought, okay, we've got to get ourselves out of this spiral we've started into of being negative with each other. And I really wanted to accomplish that. So if you mean it as sarcastic, and they'll know, don't even say it. Mary said it's all the way around for me. I tend to take fault when I know it's not really me. And Mary, we can talk about that if you want to drop me an email and maybe I can help with that. Swiftland has a program coming up called Will the Real You Stand Up? It's a webinar also. And I think it's in September, but I can't remember for sure. Maybe Taylor can look and let us know. But that's part of that. We think we are not the ones who have the right information here. So that might be an area that we can be helpful with as well, Mary. But yes, Karen, it can be taken as sarcastic, but I think if it's sincere, you can't control how they take it, can you? So I knew I was pretty sure this person would understand where I was coming from because they know my heart. They've known me for quite a while. And it was work related. But if that person I don't think has ever seen me come across as snarky or sarcastic, so they knew when I came back with the answer I came back with that I was sincere about trying to work it out. So that's part of the deal too. If you have a history with somebody of being sarcastic all the time, that's probably how they're going to take you, and it's going to take you a little longer to unwind all of that, isn't it? So the first behavior was the tank. The second behavior at the bottom of page 2 is the sniper. And I've worked with these kind of people before, but it happens to be a very common one. They make those rude, witty, cute comments when they're not about you. They're funny when they're not about you, but they are sarcastic in the name of humor, and they make you feel bad. They might roll their eyes. They might have that tone of voice about, way to go, Karen. I knew you'd make a, I knew you'd make this successful, as in, boy, did that flop. And it's that sniping that can be very hurtful to people. And I happen to have a personality that's pretty highly sensitive because of my background and my basic behavioral tendencies. And so when people do this to me, in the past, I would find myself immediately spouting something that had this tone of voice like, how dare you talk to me? And I would be very defensive. That didn't really accomplish anything because you know what? While I'm responding that way, the audience of whomever they said this in front of thought the comments were funny. It's that lighten up. I was just being funny. Except, they weren't. They were trying to make a point and use humor as a way to be snarky. So, what should you not do? Don't react. Gosh, this one took me forever to learn, folks. I can remember as recently as 6 or 7 years ago where I was in a situation where it was right on the tip of my tongue to react to that person in front of a workshop, a group of people at a workshop. We were both doing the training, and this person was, two of them actually, were sniping at me. And I came so close to sniping back. And somehow this flashed through my head that that's not going to serve me well. And I just made a very casual comment, wasn't sniping at them or anything, just a casual comment in response to what they said, and it worked out much better in that respect. Don't act hurt, even if you are. Try not to act hurt. Sometimes that's what they're looking for. Don't run away. Don't lash out. You just take a look at this. I know you're frustrated because I'm telling you all the things you shouldn't do, and those are human responses, aren't they? That's the frustrating part. It's our human response to react, to be hurt, and to show our hurt. Yes, Karen, I totally get it because I'm right there with you. To run away or to lash out. But let me ask you this: when have those reactions ever been productive? Unless it's to the extreme and it's been going on so long you have to lash out or whatever. Right, Karen, that's exactly right. They're never productive. So we need to figure out a different way to handle that, don't we? You're trying to bring this person out of hiding because they're sniping at you as if it's no big deal, as if it's just funny, et cetera, et cetera. And you need to draw that behavior out and call it out without calling it out, if you know what I mean. You're trying to bring them out of hiding without making a big deal out of it. So how do you do that? Sometimes it's a matter of stopping and looking at them. Again, most of these behaviors that I'm trying to teach you to do make your stomach churn because you're not used to doing them. But I've used this in a workshop before, and I just stopped and looked at that person. For the person at the front of the room, when somebody's behaving this way and making sniping remarks, we call that heckling. And I just stopped and looked at this person, and I said, Mike, I heard you say something about XYZ. Well, Mike was embarrassed to begin with. His face got red because I actually had addressed it, but I had done it very calmly while my stomach was churning, while my palms were sweating. And I said, would you share with us what you think we could have done differently? Because we were actually in a training workshop of supervisors and he was being snarky toward me. And I had to do something, didn't I? Because I lose the credibility of the group. And we lose credibility at work if we allow people to continue to treat us this way. He said, no, it wasn't important. But you know what? The next session we had, it was a long-term training I was doing with this group. The next session we had, he behaved totally different toward me. And for the rest of the time I was training with them, which was for about another year, we were fine together because he knew it wasn't going to work. He just wanted attention. What do you do about third-party sniping? This is when somebody comes to you and says, did you hear what Deb said about you? That's third party, isn't it? If Deb's the one that sniped at me, then I need to be dealing with Deb. So sometimes the person that is coming to you as an informant is actually a sniper. They're just trying to keep things stirred up. They want to make sure that they can make a point about how good they are compared to the person that they say is doing the sniping. So if you think that's what's happening and you think they took somebody's comment out of context and exaggerated it or distorted it or just totally took it out of the way it was meant, you can say to them, does so and so know that you came to me about this? Wow, talk about stopping somebody in their tracks. If I go to Deb and I say, do you know what Taylor said about you? If Deb says to me, does Taylor know you're here? Oh my goodness. That's going to stop me in my tracks, isn't it? And that's what I want to do with that third party sniper. The thing is, though, you want to let them know you're not going to talk about the other person behind their back. So I would say to Deb, let's go to Taylor together. Now, Deb's going to find every reason in the world not to do that, isn't she? Because she's been sniping behind Taylor's back and coming to me and trying to make me feel bad about Taylor. We've all been in through this, even if it was in elementary school, because aren't some of these behaviors elementary behaviors? So just say, I'd rather not talk about Taylor behind her back. So, Deb, let's go talk to her together and see if we can figure out what was really going on. Again, not comfortable. That's why they're difficult behaviors, folks. They're not comfortable to deal with. Sometimes, though, when Deb comes to me, maybe I trust Deb explicitly and I know that whatever she's saying, there must be something going on. I need to stop what I'm doing and go directly to the person that might be sniping at me behind my back. In other words, if Deb says, I don't know if you realize this, but when you're doing XYZ, Taylor is saying this. If I trust Deb, there's no reason to draw her into that conversation. I can go directly to Taylor and say, I understand this is what's going on. Now, the first thing Taylor's going to say is, how did you find out? It doesn't really matter, does it? But that's their defense. So I'm not going to reveal my source. I'm not going to say, well, Deb told me, because it doesn't matter. I can just say it doesn't really matter how I found out. Is it true? And then sometimes I have to be quiet and wait till that person responds, and usually they'll deny it. You can let it go if they deny it. Even if you know in your heart it's true because you trust Deb and you're certain it's true, all you're trying to do is get them to stop. You want them to be uncomfortable enough that they're not going to do that to you again. You don't really care if they confess that this is what they've been doing. You just want them to think the next time they get ready to do it, uh-oh, I got called out on it the last time. I'm not going to do it again. So sometimes somebody is sniping, and the person that comes to you to tell you you can trust them, then you need to go back to the sniper and deal with it directly. So the next one is a know-it-all. This is the person that really does know it all. They're not faking it. They're not pretending to know it all. They're very competent. They're highly assertive. They have a very low tolerance for correction, so they tend to be kind of controlling. You need to understand that they really do know a lot. So what do you do about that? For them, new ideas are perceived as a threat. This might be somebody who's been on your staff a long time. It might be somebody who just got out of school, who feels like they already know all they need to know because they just got out of school. These people, because they do know a lot, are humiliated if they're wrong because they thought they knew everything there was to know. You're not trying to humiliate them. That really doesn't usually accomplish anything. So you're not trying to become a know-it-all. You're not trying to be inflexible with the know-it-all as if you know it all and they say, no, I know it all. And then what is that going to accomplish? And you don't want to become impatient with them. I know it's frustrating when people can't see any other perspective. But keep in mind that they really do have a lot to contribute. They really are very competent. And that's what you want to be aware of as you're dealing with their difficult behavior. But what you're also trying to do is to open their minds to new ideas. I don't know what happened there. Something went wonky. You want to open their minds to new ideas without them feeling threatened. And especially, I'm just going to put this out there because I am in this group. Those of us who have a lot of experience tend to feel a bit threatened sometimes by new ideas. So keep that in mind. You don't want to make them feel bad about their extensive knowledge and their extensive experience. You just want to help them open their mind to new ideas. So how do you do that? Well, one thing is be prepared because they're pretty knowledgeable. And they may have already read the article on XYZ programming and determined that because of their history and the library's history, it's not going to work in your library. So be prepared so that you know your stuff. Because if you don't, this is the person, the know-it-all, can transfer into a tank right in the same conversation. Because you're saying something they don't believe in, they're just going to run right over the top of you. So do you see how that can transfer into a different difficult behavior? So know your stuff. Stand your ground with this person as well. And backtrack respectfully. Say something along the lines, and I pick on Deb because I can. She doesn't mind, I'm sure. But backtrack respectfully and say, well, Deb, I know you have a lot of experience with this, and you mentioned that you didn't see how this could possibly work. I think it could, though. So can we talk about what you see as the obstacles here? Use them. Tap into that knowledge and that competence that they already have and just say, I really respect the knowledge that you have and how much experience you have with these kinds of programs. I think this is an idea that will work. I've been reading up on it a lot. I've been talking to patrons a lot, but I know you're hesitant. So I hear that hesitation. Can we talk about what makes you hesitant? You've just shown respect for them, haven't you? As long as you're not being sarcastic, as long as you don't say, yeah, I know you've been here a long time. Well, you shut them down, haven't you, when you do that? So remember at the very beginning, I talked a lot about this is about how you interact with them. If you approach any of these ways of dealing with these things in a sarcastic way, in a condescending way, or anything like that, you're not going to move forward with this particular conversation or discussion. You want to blend with their ideas and their doubts. You want to say, I can see why that would cause you concern. And I hear you saying we should do it this way. What would happen if we did it this way and then also added this piece to the program? Do you see how that's very indirect? What would happen if we took your idea about the basic program, but we also allowed people the option of blah, blah, blah? Now I've introduced my new idea indirectly to them because I'm turning them into a mentor, aren't I? And I'm showing that respect. And I'm feeling that respect because I do know they have a lot of knowledge, but I'm also then able to present that new idea indirectly without them feeling threatened. We don't want them to feel threatened. Then there's the whiner, the complainer, the negative person that for me, as I mentioned, is one of the most difficult ones to deal with and can so often come out of some of the other behaviors. Think about a tank who isn't getting his or her way. They might start whining about that in the middle of a conversation. Think about the know it all who's not getting their way. Easy to become a whiner, isn't it? Think about the people you deal with in your own personal life. You probably have some whiners. This could also maybe be called negative Nelly. Exactly, Michelle. I really have trouble with this type. Yes, I have a program called Negative Nell or Positive Paul. Exactly. I struggle with this too because I really work on being the optimist in the group, being the positive person, not rose colored glasses or anything like that, but to try to take every situation and find the positive in it or find how we can turn it to a positive. And this person immediately goes to the negative, don't they? That's what can be so frustrating about the whiner. And so frustrating when they switch right in the middle of a conversation and start whining about something. I'm going to give you a personal example that is a little bit off topic, but you'll see how frustrating this can be. I was out walking my dog. It's probably been 6 weeks ago. It was after we'd had a whole bunch of rain and all the leaves had come down from the trees. And so I live in a community where our homeowners association fee pays for lawn care. So I was walking the dog and I met one of my neighbors out walking her dog, and she said, you know, when I first moved here, they blew our leaves almost every day. And I said, wow, that must have been expensive. That must have been hard for them to keep up with our homeowners fee in there. And I really don't want to pay to have somebody blowing leaves every single day. They're just leaves and more of them will come down tomorrow. And so I'm friends with this person. So I just made that comment trying to get them to see a different perspective. And she said, well, it just looks awful with all these leaves around. So we went our separate ways. 2 days later, and I'm not exaggerating, 2 days later, we were walking our dogs, crossing over each other again, and our maintenance folks were out blowing leaves. And you know what she said to me? Could they be any louder? And I said, but at least they're blowing the leaves. And I just kept walking with my dog that day because I had this smirk on my face thinking, do you hear yourself here? And it was one of those situations where you could see that it didn't matter what the folks were doing, it was not good enough. And I really struggle with that. And so I will tell you that one thing I do that I probably don't even have written down here is I limit my exposure to that when I can, even the people I work with. I work with clients, as I said, all over the state. Sometimes I'll go to a face-to-face workshop and somebody will start in with the negative Nelly stuff, the whiner stuff, and all of that. And I will actually go to lunch in a different room, or I will take, if I'm on a break, I will say, I need to go out and get a breath of fresh air, which I do at that point because I can't stand the whining. So sometimes just limiting your exposure if you can, especially if it's a family member. I know you can't get away from them completely. I had somebody ask me that once. They said, I call them yeah, but people. It's a nice day out. Yeah, but I wanted to stay off work today or whatever it is. And she said, well, what if the yeah, but people are your family members? And that's when I said, the best you can do usually is to, number one, limit your exposure. Number two, set a good example. When I first met my husband many years ago, he was a Yebit person. He was a bit of a, not so much a whiner, but very negative. Everything was very negative. And we really worked on that together over the years because he knew it wasn't serving him well. And bless his heart, when he got very, very ill, he really struggled with being positive because he knew that was something that he'd worked to overcome all those years. And one day he looked at me and he said, I'm sorry I'm being so negative. And I said, you know what? You don't need to apologize for that because if anybody deserves to be negative right now, it's you. And I gave him permission to do that. He still tried to fight against it, but sometimes it's justified. But limit your exposure is one thing to do. You recognize these people because they wallow in it. It's something very simple and they're going to wallow. I can't believe I have to work Saturday again. I always get Saturdays. They have this sense of futility. You can tell by their tone of voice that they're going to be a whiner. And sometimes just limiting your exposure, if that means going and getting a drink of water, if that means taking your break someplace other than the break room, whatever that might mean. But you know them because they whine. It's just that simple. They don't have any real solutions. Even if there might be a logical solution, they're not going to work that hard on it. They're just going to whine about it. So don't count on them to enter the conversation with solutions, but maybe that's something that we can work toward. So, okay, you know the process here. What should we not do? You can, Karen, acknowledge their whining sometimes. It depends. Again, be very strategic, very discerning. How close are you to this person? Sometimes with a whiner, you can even tap into them as a resource, so to speak, sort of like we did with the know-it-all, but in a little bit of a different perspective. And you can say, Deb, you have a really good way of fleshing out what might go wrong. So what do you think might go wrong with this? So you actually almost it works though, Karen, with some people. I'm not going to say it's going to work with everybody, but I've used this before. And when I tap into that, not to be sarcastic again, but I know this person's going to turn to the negative first thing. And if I tap into that and almost circumvent their whining because I've asked them to give me the negative up front, it can be very effective. It just depends on the person. So be aware that it's a very good technique. It doesn't work with everybody. I know one person in my life that it doesn't work with at all, and I'm around her fairly frequently, and I just have to accept that she's going to go to the negative because I'll say, you know, have you ever thought of, and I will give her another option, but she immediately goes back to the negative. Sometimes you just have to accept that. Another thing I want you to really be aware of is don't absorb their negativity. Okay, so don't be a whiner. Don't start whining with them. You're going to love this. Don't agree or disagree. That makes no sense, does it? But if you agree with them, what do? Well, Linda said she feels this way too. And if you disagree with them, what are they going to do? They're going to whine louder or they're going to become a tank. Another thing to keep in mind is don't try to solve their problem. They always do this and I don't know what to do about this. What happens if you always solve their problem? What if this is the person that is doing this all the time? They're whining all the time. What happens when you always solve their problems? Yep, they keep coming back. They drag you down. Remember I said what gets rewarded gets repeated? So if Michelle comes to me and she's whining and she always whines, and I just don't want to listen to it today, so I'm just going to fix it because I'm a fixer. I'm a doer. Then next time something happens, Michelle's going to come right back to me and I am going to be drained, as Karen says. She's going to drag me down because now I got to solve her problem again. Why wouldn't she come back if I'm going to solve her problem? So what you're trying to do with this person is to form a problem-solving partnership. You are trying to acknowledge their whining from the perspective of, well, let's figure out how we can fix it, Karen. If Karen starts whining to me about this or that or the other thing, I can say, okay, I hear that you feel like there's nothing that can be done here, but let's try to figure out a way we can fix it together. So you're trying to form that partnership so that they're not always draining you and expecting you to fix the situation. But if you help them form that problem solving partnership with you, then the next time they may still come back to you for help, but at some point down the road, they may just go ahead and fix it. They might not. There are people out there that want that attention and hand holding and so forth, and they'll keep coming back to you, but at least it's a partnership now and you're not fixing the whole problem. So you want to solve it. You want to deal with this by forming a problem solving partnership. How do you do that? Listen for the main points. One thing we need to understand about the whiner is they're pretty perceptive about the things that are going to go wrong. So sometimes listening for those main points can help you figure out how you can form that problem solving partnership. You might need to interrupt them. Okay, it's gone on for 7 minutes and 32 seconds, and I got to stop this somewhere. So I might say, well, Karen, I hear what you're saying, so let's stop here and figure out what we can do. What do you think would happen with XYZ? What do you mean that this is going to be a failure? How do you perceive that being a failure? And then you focus on solutions with them. Okay, we know we're going to go ahead, we're going to put this new software into play. That's already a given. It's been handed down from administration that this is what we're going to do. So how can we solve the issues that you see coming? And then as you're moving along with whatever it was they thought was going to be a catastrophe, track the progress. Hey, Karen, did you see that we got through that first run of that software and there was only one glitch? Wow, we did really well. And you track that progress so that they see that there can be positives that come out of things that they felt were going to be totally negative. So the question then becomes on page 5, we covered 4 of them pretty quickly, and that's why I gave you the handout so you would have your little mini manual, because again, I hope you don't have to deal with any of these people for the next 6 months. But if you do, you'll have this in front of you. So the question becomes on page 5 of your handouts in the middle, I've given you some space. Pick out one of them if you recognize one of these behaviors. Do you recognize a tank or a sniper or a know-it-all or a whiner? What makes you think that's their difficult behavior? And now pick out just one of them that you can do something different to overcome that difficult behavior. So take just a moment to do that, and then we'll move forward with some other little tips and techniques that you'll find helpful. Karen says, I have a tank in my life and I had just ignored their behavior and stopped talking them. I had to just ignore their behavior and stop talking to them. And sometimes that's the only appropriate response, isn't it? Because you cannot change that person. You cannot fix that person's behavior. And sometimes as a protective measure, it involves actually stopping talking to them or, as I said earlier, at least limiting our exposure, right? When I used to talk to my sister, bless her heart, because she was so passive aggressive, she was the kind of person that would give in, give in, give in until she exploded and then look out. And there would be days, and it was always on Saturday when I talked to her. I talked to her during my treadmill time because I felt that that was a productive way to use that negative interaction because most of the time it could be pretty negative. But there were days where I would actually have to wait for a while before I called her until I could get my mental faculties together to be able to kind of shield myself from that. because the last thing I needed, especially before my husband died last year, the last thing I needed was to add more negativity in my life because of what we were dealing with his issues. So sometimes that's what it is. Ernestine says, I have a whiner and offer one-on-one training. Okay, all right, that's good. Janet says, I've got a sniper in the department. She uses a technique to get her way or things done to her desire. I've had to tell her that she cannot speak for others and I will talk to the source. Absolutely. And you know what they need to find out? That behavior doesn't work with you. That's why they use the behavior, though, isn't it? Because it works in other situations. And in any of the bad behaviors we're either talking about today or others that you know of that we didn't have a chance to cover, we need to help people understand that it's not going to work with us. And when they learn that, it doesn't mean they stop the behavior, but it will often stop the behavior with us. And that's what becomes so important for us. So let's take a quick look at some of these other tips that might be helpful to us. One of the reasons that we don't always deal as well with it as we possibly could is sometimes we want to tell our own side first. It's that defensiveness. They've come at us, they've exhibited a behavior that we find very, very difficult. And so we want to tell our own side or we want to get our way. And sometimes we don't listen very well. Maybe the whiner or the know-it-all actually is telling us something that could be beneficial, but because we aren't listening closely, we are not tapping into what they're actually saying. We are just assuming that it's a difficult behavior and it's not going to be beneficial for us to go that direction. Sometimes we're afraid we won't get our own way. That was, remember I told you the situation where I had the email from somebody? That person had a good perspective, but it wasn't what I thought should be done. And I want to get my own way. And then when I let it rest overnight, I thought, you know what? I can work with this. I can deal with this in a different way that's not going to turn into each of us trying to get our own way. Sometimes we don't deal with difficult behaviors well because we think one of us has to lose. And in reality, many times, if we'll just take a step back, we can make sure it comes out to be a win-win situation. Stephen Covey, you all know the book, Seven Habits of Highly Effective People. One of the things he said was seek first to understand, then be understood. Because we may be perceiving something as a difficult behavior that really isn't a difficult behavior. It's just a difference in opinion, a difference in perspective. Maybe it's time for us to learn something new. So seek first to understand and then be understood can go a long way in us de-escalating their difficult behaviors and not moving into our own difficult behaviors. That can be a life motto for some of us. And whether we agree with what they're saying or doing doesn't matter. It's whether we understand that they have a right to that perspective, and then we can express our own perspective. Number 5 at the top of page 6. Another tip is understand what I'm feeling. Have self-awareness. Some of you know that I love the topic of emotional intelligence, and that's where all this really originates, isn't it? We have to have that self-awareness, understand what I'm feeling, and be able to deal with those emotions in a productive manner. And then maybe even ask, what's it like to be in their shoes? You know, sometimes their difficult behaviors are coming from places they don't even understand. Maybe they are taking care of a significant other that has health issues or an elderly parent, or they have financial issues or relationship issues, or they don't feel confident in what they're doing in their jobs or whatever it might be. But what's it like to be in their shoes? Maybe that's where that difficult behavior is originating from. And if we just had a little more understanding, we wouldn't even have to worry about using those techniques we just talked about, because we started from a place of trying to understand where they're coming from. Number 7 says, don't point fingers. It's rarely effective. I can remember being in a meeting with a client once, and there were several trainers that worked with the same client. Sometimes we even did team training, and one of our trainers had missed a training. She'd forgotten to write it down on her physical calendar. She put it in her phone and somehow missed it and didn't show up. And the person said, that was the client running the meeting, well, we know whose fault it was. How are we going to fix it? Well, that didn't make anybody in the room feel good. She could have handled it in a much more productive way by just saying, well, it already happened, so how can we move forward? But she was pointing fingers, and so all of us kind of slumped down in our seats, even those of us who did not miss the training. But pointing fingers isn't usually productive, is it? It's okay if we can say, okay, this is what happened. How can we make sure it doesn't happen in the future? But pointing fingers usually isn't that productive. Number 8 says, own your own experience. Take responsibility for how you're responding to this person's behavior. Understand, again, like I said, they do it because it works for them. How are you going to respond to them? That belongs to you. You own that experience and your reaction. And remember that every behavior does have an intention, and a lot of times it has a totally different effect, doesn't it? Their behavior, they have some kind of an intention, like the book said, but a lot of times the effect is actually different than what they intended. Their intention becomes distorted, and it's always toward the negative. We always distort it toward the negative. We think that their bad behavior is so totally different than what they actually intended. So at the bottom of page 6, this is for you to work through. We don't have time to really discuss it, but I do want you to use that handout to kind of zero in on which of those items can be helpful to you, which one might you need to work on, why do you think you need to work on it, and how are you going to work on it? And then also give some thought to what's one thing you learned today? What was your aha moment that's going to be helpful to you? Reflect on that after you leave today's webinar. Just take that couple of extra minutes and say, okay, there's one thing in there that I'm going to work on today that I know will be helpful to me. And if there's any way I can help in the future, you know you're always welcome to drop me an email. And if I'm not traveling, I usually get back to you within 24 hours. And if I am, sometimes I don't check in on my email. But I don't check in when I'm traveling, but I'm hardly ever on the road for more than 2 or 3 days at a time. So I'll always get back to you as quickly as I can. Let me know how I can help, and I hope to see you at a future webinar. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Linda, for an informative webinar. Attendees, if you enjoyed this webinar, we ask that you join us on July 26th for Linda's next webinar, Power to the Introverts and Extroverts. As always, we encourage you to keep an eye on the Swiftland CE calendar, the Swiftland Facebook page, or your message from the listserv. Thank you, Evan, for attending, and have a terrific rest of the day.